think we're live. Welcome, everybody. We're the Bevry community. We're joined here today with myself, John Buck, and Brett, Pleasure of Doubt, and also Sumit, who he's kind of tired, but if you have any questions, Sumit, or anything like that, something to add, just be sure to speak up and we'll be able to get those from you. But hi, we're going to be discussing John Vervaeke's 22nd and 23rd. Oh, right. 23rd and 24th lectures from the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series. I think we're coming up to the close on his, I guess, genealogy of the meaning crisis. He refers to it as in the 24th one. And I think he'll be moving more into, I guess, his own understanding of the meaning crisis and his, I guess, prescriptive response to it as well, which will be quite interesting, I think. But so, yeah, today we're going to be kind of focusing on the Romantics, kind of following over from Kant, and then also the kind of responses, as well as Hegel, which is kind of, seems interesting. Like Hegel is almost like a meta philosopher in a way, where he's actually almost similar to like what Vervaeke's doing. It's getting this broader approach from actually looking at history and the genealogy of philosophy as this kind of dialectic through history, which is pretty interesting. Kind of like, yeah, what Vervaeke's doing. So I'm guessing, considering this is the end somewhat to his, or close to the end of his genealogy of philosophy in regards to the meaning crisis, that he's probably going to be drawing quite a bit from Hegel. And there's other portions, like in describing Hegel's work, that it seems I kind of see the connections there, where he's referred to Hegel as bringing forward a sort of philosophical system that is connected to mythology, that works as like a secular replacement for religions due to the insufficiencies of religions, as well as the insufficiencies of secularism.
Yeah, he seems to be noting that, these guys, Kant, Hegel, get some things deeply right, but also are missing some key ingredients. And the sense is what's coming is he's going to provide those key ingredients to bring back in this sense of participatory knowing that he finds missing from Kant and Hegel, and which I think he's going to argue is one of the reasons why their philosophies have led to so much chaos and bloodshed with the rise of Marx, communism and communist and other authoritarian regimes that have sort of built seem to be more closely linked to Kant and Hegel than any others, but have taken it in a pretty scary
right. Yeah, that is actually, a good point. So from Kant or from Hegel, we recognize like Marx kind of being a student of Hegel, in a sense, kind of using the dialectic of history in a more materialistic or economic sense, like using it in understanding, the cultural shifts that occur within the physical world, rather than in the mental space. And same for Kant. Well, it's not so much Kant, but at least the other Romantics of the time, that like he explicitly brings forward how the Romanticism sort of brings forth the ideas that found the French Revolution, which indeed was very bloody and full of a very much incarnation of the Romantics ideas into fruition.
Yeah, he doesn't spend much time on the French Revolution, but he spends a lot more time bringing in Marx. And I mean, he describes this whole procedure of this burgeoning meaning crisis as, I guess, this gradual over hundreds of years of getting away from this participatory Gnostic style knowing. And he hasn't, I don't think he's quite brought it home yet, because one question I have is, he talks a lot about this connection to reality. And that's indeed important. But I'm not sure why connection to reality is equated to meaning. I got it more when he was talking about meaning coming from getting a better sense of your more comfort, say, with your agent arena relationships. But that's a bit divorced from reality per se. It's that however you interpret reality, you find your place in it. That's what I got from that. And that's what makes life meaningful. So you're a parent, you have a child, and you have a relationship to that child, and you see yourself as the parent taking care of that child, that agent arena relationship, and that gives you a deep sense of meaning, whether or not it's objectively true in any exterior sense.
Yeah, it seems almost like there's this, I guess, continuation of Descartes, where in order to sort of resolve the meaning crisis that occurs within individuals, there's a inclination towards finding certainty in something, whether it's certainty that you find, say, within Kant, of recognizing there are certain things that we cannot even know simply because it's outside, like our very framework for thinking is also a limiter that disallows us from being able to think certain things. Like, still, we can at least be certain of that within a Kantian understanding of there are certain things that we cannot know. And yeah,
well,
yeah.
If we define knowledge as certainty, that almost seems knowledge has to be defined as certainty, to say we cannot know. We cannot know with 100% certainty.
Right. Yeah. And that's actually a good point. So, like with Kant, maybe we can explain, I guess, a bit of the phenomenal and noumenal distinction. Vervaeke brings up how, for Descartes, he had this sort of problem where he had the world of matter and then the world of mind, and we had the way in which we could mathematically describe everything through geometry, but there's a way in which that is like not connected exactly, because we between having we have our mental world, and then we have all the mathematical worlds, and there's sort of a sharp distinction there, and there's not really a way to make sense of how the two are connected. And that was, I guess, sort of like the critique being presented by Pascal. But Kant's, it seems like his way in which to integrate the world of mathematics and how we understand things into the world of like qualia and being able to experience is by fitting it within the phenomenal. So, like, the reasons that mathematics work so well in being able to describe the world is not so much because the world is like created with mathematical forms or something that it's connected to. Kant saying that the reason it works so well is because these mathematical formulations of the world are, or rules or laws or whatever, are what is necessary for our own thinking. And so because these are like, I guess, more like expression. It's not like when we make a mathematical description of reality, it's less so that we're actually like getting behind the veil of reality. Rather, we're getting behind, or we're getting the most clear-cut expression of our way of conceiving of reality through this like simplified abstraction or mathematical formula that we might have.
Well, that's it. These guys seem to make these sharp differentiations, and I don't really get it. First of all, the obsession with certainty. I find Cogito Ergo Sum great. I remember reading it back in university 20 years ago, and it's a real, it's really, it's interesting and thought-provoking to think about. But he's asking the question, what can we be certain of without any chance of error? And I agree with that. The assumption seems to be, the next step is, okay, if we can't be certain about all this other stuff, what's the implication of that? And I don't know that they spend the time on that. It seems to be they're like saying, oh my God, we can't be certain of everything else. So let's just, so it's, but the question is, how often in practice do we act based on certain knowledge? we
Right.
act on uncertainty all the time. And to me, I don't have a problem with that. It doesn't seem to be a crisis that, I can say, okay, there are very few things I can be absolutely certain of. There's this infinitesimal chance that I'm just a brain in a vat, or I'm just that mind is all there is, and that I'm the only mind that exists, and you're all figments of my imagination. But there's overwhelming evidence that that's not the case. So even though there's this tiny fraction of a chance that it's true, it doesn't. It's a mental exercise. It's
Mm-hmm.
interesting to talk about in conversations like this. It makes the head spin a bit, but there are zero decisions that I ever make based on that infinitesimally small chance that solipsism, that hard solipsism, is true.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
that's a good point. And like maybe kind of wish he went a little bit further into Blaise Pascal, because I think Blaise Pascal was sort of like the one of the main fathers to like what is it? The well, like probability theory, and kind
right.
of building up like decision making
Mhm.
theories based upon probabilities, and like that's where you kind of get the Pascal's wager as well. But I haven't ever read the exact wager itself, so I think there's a lot of ways in which people are kind of like retooling it and working it to try to make sense of it. But I think there's like there's certain figures that follow in his footsteps in a lot of ways, that like what's his name, the Swedish philosopher in Harvard, that Nick Bostrom. He has this like existential threat level sort of way of making decisions, where based upon what are the probabilities that this will lead to the extinction of the human race, and then
Right.
even if it's a very small probability, because it's such a high level of a threat,
We should take it seriously.
yeah, it's worth taking seriously and putting effort into, which is very much like centered around like we're making decisions not based on any sort of certainty, but based upon like certain things that we're unsure of, and then working from there. And I agree with you that by focusing too much on what we can know with certainty, we're sort of like inhibiting ourselves in being able to still make rational decisions in uncertainty.
All right. So, I mean, as Vervaeke describes it, Kant says math our ways of measuring the world mathematically aren't features of the world. They are the way in which experience has to be organized in order to make sense of the world. Now, I mean, to that, I get that to the extent that as long as we're saying that for me to make sense of the world, I grab onto certain patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And math is one of those patterns. We recognize certain patterns, and I think math works because of the regularity of the world, of the universe. Because things work in a regular manner, we can create axioms, we can identify axioms, and that we recognize through countless examples, and then we can generalize from that. That's why math often works. I mean, I think there's some math that probably has no practical application because it's just purely theoretical, not linked to those patterns, because you could sort of create other axioms. But we don't have to think that math is either creating the world. It's a way we use of observing the world. It's a way of organizing all the information out there, that because it's so, to allow us to function in the world. So it's not creating the world, nor it's not nor being created by the world. It's a pattern that we
Mm-hmm.
observe over and
Well,
over again.
well, there's the thing that like within certain like physicists, they'll find a mathematical pattern like that you can use to kind of like understand gravity or something like that, and the way that they're thinking of it is not so much as a pattern, but as a constraint to the world. Like this is a law of nature, which is like this mathematical formulation. I don't know, connects to it somehow, or it describes it accurately.
It's a law until we find a pattern that doesn't match it.
Right.
Right. So I mean that's it. We call them laws because we
Mm-hmm.
haven't found exceptions. But that's not to say that we can't find exceptions and we won't find exceptions, or that whatever regularity we're currently experiencing won't change at some point or hasn't changed at some point in the past. You know, it's a function of regularity that all these patterns sort of work to predict the future.
Right.
Pattern mapping, these models work to predict the future.
And that was a point that Vervaeke makes, is that the Newtonian understanding of gravity is very different from what Einstein kind of gives us. But I mean, there's still many instances where people will be using sort of Newtonian mechanics to sort of chart, say, the stars, or charting the rotation or the orbits of the planet, things like that, where it still works just fine. And like the more complex understandings of like gravity, it is not really as necessary. So yeah, there's a way in which you can say that the formulations of gravity or laws or anything like that are simply the articulations that we have for the patterns, rather than any sort of I guess the undergirding of reality that we're like connecting to or recognizing.
And it's like, and the pattern, it's true, the pattern exists in our mind, meaning, you know, it's our representation of what we see happening over and over again. But those things happening over and over again, we have every reason to believe are happening over and over again. You know, those things are happening, whether or not we identify them as a pattern or not. So it's sort of, you know, it imposes a structure of intelligibility on our experience. It helps us make sense of things. But then these guys seem to make the jump to, therefore the real world, the exterior world almost doesn't exist, which just seems to be like a hard jump. You know, like Vervaeke says, it makes our mind imprisoned, except at every stage, our mind is a filter. Our brain is receiving information from outside, and our experience is filtered through that translation. But there's something that is coming into there is information that we're taking in that's coming from somewhere, you know, that seems to be, from what we can tell, outside of the mind. So I'm not sure why it's described as not being in contact with the exterior world, because all of it is. It's information about the exterior world.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because like Kant puts up this clear distinction that we cannot know the thing in itself. All we can really know are the phenomenological responses that we might have to that. And the fact of the matter might be that what we see as a observation of reality might rather instead be a observation of our limitations of apprehending this reality. But I think you're right that it's you can't exactly say that we can't know the thing in itself at all, or anything about the thing in itself, because in fact, to quote Wittgenstein, let's see, I guess is his referring to his book Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. The aim of the book is to set a limit to thought, or rather, not to thought, but to the expressions of thoughts. In order to be able to set a limit to thought, we should have to find both sides of the limit thinkable, i.e., we should have to be able to think what cannot be thought. And I think it applies to Kant in that, like, in order to say that there are certain components to reality that we cannot know, you would have to be at a vantage point of being able to know reality and be able to know all the limits that we as observers of reality have, in order to determine whether or not there are things that are outside of our capability of knowing.
Right. So recognize the context in which we're experiencing things. I mean, we can say, yes, in reality, things have no color. Things don't look, outside of our minds, things don't look like anything, because sight and vision is a product of information being translated in our brains. But that doesn't mean it's not something that's out there, that we are interpreting that whatever it is in a certain way. But that gives us a pretty strong idea there is something there to be interpreted.
Right. Yeah, kind of similar to Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" argument, that because we're observing something, that we must have there must be something there to observe.
Or they're most
Otherwise,
likely, it's not a must because there's this small chance that it's not. Or again, we have hallucinations, and sometimes our brains do construct similar
right.
images that are not actually there. But then we have other ways of doing it. Hey, can you see that? Yeah, I can see that too. So when we both can see it, it gives us a better sense that yes, it's real. Now, there's still some very, very small chance there's nothing there.
Mm-hmm.
Now I don't know if I'm just missing something here because these guys are obviously smarter than I am, and why are they seeing it this way? Uh, there's something. I think there has to be something I'm missing here, of why they're so deep into this.
Mm.
In this idealism aspect, or why they're so freaked out by the lack of certainty. Uh, like why do they seem like I've just described it in a way that I think is much less isolated. We're constantly receiving information from all this stuff. That's not isolated. We're right in there. We're just not perfect. We do have to filter it. So we're not getting it exact, but we're getting it. We're getting a heck of a lot of it. So why is that doesn't provoke an existential crisis in me, at least. But maybe I'm missing something.
Well, there's a point that Vervaeke explained Kant in a way that really made sense to me, is that kind of I guess our own minds, or our own capacity to have phenomenological experiences, is dependent upon or our mind itself is a filter frame for how information can be even inputted into it. So like he brings up the example of the cat again, where the H in the and the A in cat are basically the same letter, but because of the way in which like we read English, we interpret that letter first as an H and then secondly as an A. That the mechanism by which we can interpret the little scrawlings on the chalkboard as words and have meaning behind it is due to these, I guess, like culturally ingrained ideas about language, for instance. And that's not to say that we're accurately apprehending the meaning to the word. We're more so like touching back on our own cultural indoctrination for what these letters are supposed to mean. So like if somebody that didn't understand the English language at all were to look at those letters, they wouldn't be able to kind of get that meaning. But when we look at the letters, because we've already had this system inside our own minds to understand it, that's what allows us to kind of get some sort of meaning out of it.
But that's also because that's an entirely human created simple machinery. Mm-hmm. So but that seems to be a different issue than looking at a chair. Mm-hmm. And like I can say language exists only in the mind. Those symbols, I mean, there's something physical out there of scratches on a piece of paper, right? Mm-hmm. But the actual construct of language is totally constructed by humans, right? We've just put that together. We've decided this means that. So you have to have that bottom up and top down going at the same time. It's all within, like, but I'm not sure where I'm going.
Yeah, so I think with Kant, like his movement is referred to sometimes as like transcendental idealism, that there are certain constraints to the way in which we think that are kind of like what we have to kind of use to build up from, even though they may not really be referring to anything in the noumenal world. But they are at least certain prerequisites to thinking within the phenomenological world, similar to kind of like Kant's usage of like creating a categorical imperative, like insofar as this rule can be applied or insofar as there are constraints to thinking about, let's say, morality in general. Like you have to presume some semblance of free will or responsibility for actions in order to build up any sort of moral or ethical system. Similar to that, in order to
I could contest that, but that's another discussion.
Well, I mean, an ethical system is about what one ought to do, and what one ought to do has to do with what one is capable of doing, which is directly from Kant. Ought implies can. And so if there is no capability to perform actions that are being prescribed to you, then it is a, I don't know, useless system of morality, because it's just responding, it's prescribing things that cannot be achieved.
Does the system of morality play a role in that causal chain? Does having this concept of morality influence your actions in whether it's a feeling of morality or just a mental propositional construct of reality? Does that play a role?
I'd say so. And I think even Kant himself recognizes that there are avenues for which, like, a noble lie or the like perfect character of a virtuous person would be a beneficial mechanism to, like, spread forth for the masses, and sort of like in order to aid them in living the ethical life.
So it shows that these ideas play as much a role in the causal chain as anything else. And I think they work and they play just the same role whether or not we have free will.
So by providing a ethical system, even if there was no free will, the ethical system itself could have some sort of causal relations in providing. And I think that kind of fits within Kant's framework, that there are, whether what was I going to say? Whether or not we do or do not have free will, by acting or by creating ethical frameworks in which have sort of the presupposition that you have the ability to perform these actions within the ethical framework, that provides the system that is almost equivalent to having some sort of free will. So it may just be a phenomenological illusion that we have, and there is no noumenological reality of a free will or little cogito ergo sum running around inside our heads or anything like that. The fact that it's like a prerequisite to kind of move forward is justification enough, I guess, in this sort of uncertainty of what the noumenon is. But anyway, there's, I think, like 3 bases for thinking rational, like this is why it's called transcendental idealism, where it cannot be proven within itself, but in order to even work within rationality, you have to sort of take these for granted, because they're like, you cannot have rational thoughts that do not derive from these kind of presuppositions. And it's like causality, temporality, I think, as in like time, like having our thoughts are constrained by time. We cannot think outside of time passing. Like we cannot think of eternal thoughts or something like that. And then there's one other one as well. This sucks. There's a lecture from, I believe it was Wes Cecil on, no wait, it's not Wes Cecil. Wes Cecil also has a lecture on Kant, but there's it's Will Durant. That's right, Will Durant. There's a video on Kant, which I think explained his thoughts quite well. It takes a couple listens, because I remember I listened to it like probably like 4 years back or something like that. Didn't really get anything out of it, and then I listened to it again like 2 years ago, and then something like a month or so ago. and you kind of get something new out of each time, even though I haven't read anything.
Well, that's what he's talking about, you know, but because as you pick up the grammar, that's what he talks a lot about. Vervaeke talks about grammar a lot. What these guys do, one of the most useful things these guys do is provide a language to talk about all these concepts. And the more you get comfortable with that language, the more you're able to think about those concepts. But the ideal, so his idealism, does it? I always thought idealism entailed there's only mind, that the real world is a product of mind, that everything that exists is a product of mind. So matter is a product of mind, and nothing exists outside of mind. Does he mean it that way?
I think he means it in the, like, we're constrained within the phenomenological realm, that anything that we are going to speak about or discuss, like under philosophy or rationality, is going to be constrained within the mind, or aspects of what we can recognize with the mind. So I think we talked about this last discussion with the regular, like, philosophy of idealism. All the things in which we would normally ascribe materiality to objects, as like what we have the basis for understanding an object's material basis is its dimensions and its weight and its hardness, things like that. These are all perceptual, phenomenological descriptions that we have. And the thing is, like, we cannot conceive of an object aside from its phenomenological kind of connections that we have to it. So, like, I can't conceive of weight or like the density to an object other than how much it weighs when I try to pick it up.
Sure. But again, we're all talking there about conception, and I have no problem with that as long as we're talking about our understanding of it, our experience of it. That makes a lot of sense. And I don't know, I'm not sure why that's so scary. I mean, we just realize, yes, we're interpreting the world through our senses, through receiving information and translating it through our brains.
Right.
That to me isn't that scary. It's more scary if I'm the only thing that exists in the world, right? That there's nothing outside of mind. That's a little more mind bending, so to speak. It's a little more, wow, all this stuff, this stuff that I think isn't real. It doesn't exist. It's just a thing of my imagination. That to me, and some people, there are idealists, Bernardo Kastrup, for example, who hold that there's this mind at large, and we're all sort of like this mind as waves going out. Yeah, we're all subcomponents of this mind. We're all sort of experiences of this mind and contributing to its experiences of itself. But that doesn't seem to be. Maybe that's not what Kant was saying, but it almost seemed to be what Hegel was saying. When Hegel was saying that for something to be unknowable, it's as if it doesn't exist, and which I understand to an extent, that if I can't know anything about something, then I might as well act like it doesn't exist, because for my experience, it's indistinguishable from whether it exists. That being said, it still may exist, even though I don't know about it, have no contact with it, and know nothing about it.
Right. So I guess it kind of raises a couple of points. Like, is there a way that via our, I guess, constraints on being able to exist within reality, can we make assumptions or presumptions as to the nature of reality due to these constraints? So similar, like, I think Descartes' cogito ergo sum is a transcendental argument, because it's presupposing that there is something that can exist, or no, wait, there is something that if there are thoughts, then there is something thinking. And then because I recognize that there are thoughts, there must be something thinking. There's not a logical premise conclusion to it. There's like the presupposition of there being an I, and that is something that we're not getting from the conclusion, but it's like necessary in order to build up anything else. So I think there's a sort of a transcendental argument made by Aristotle that in order to deny the law of non-contradiction, you're presuming that the law of non-contradiction is true, that there cannot be both a thing and its contradiction at the same time.
Right, and then we come into superposition, and it throws that into question. It makes us think, could there be
an actual contradiction that takes place? Possibly. I don't know if
not that it is, but could there is it in the cards? Is it in the realm of possibility that we can't necessarily assume that the laws of non-contradiction hold at the micro scale, that maybe it doesn't always hold.
Yeah, and it may just be that the law of non-contradiction is sort of a constraint to constraint to logic, where like in order to think logically about anything, it's kind of like a necessary presupposition that we take on, that like whether or not it actually holds true to any like as an actual constraint to the universe, that's sort of outside of our capacity of knowing.
It's a pattern that we've recognized over time, although now again there's some potential that we've noticed patterns that may break that law, but may not, because there's different conceptions of quantum physics and different conceptions of superposition. Some, I think, imply something can be and not be at the same time, while others, I think, don't. So it's up in the air.
I'm not so sure, like, which interpretations would you think of that
like the cat is dead and not
and
dead.
Alive? Yeah.
You know, so it's X and not X. You know, that's
it seems like it's potentially X and potentially not X. Like that and I don't know if that would be a contradiction.
No, but that's not really that's not as no one would get. That doesn't break heads. It could be X or it could be Y. It's the fact that that superposition, that it's apparently both until it's observed.
Right.
That breaks your mind, right? That's what causes the consternation. That's why it's, people, we all freak out about it, because
right.
How do you grasp it?
It wouldn't be a breaking of the law of non-contradiction. So to say, like, I flip a quarter and then it is like the landing of the quarter is both potentially heads up and potentially tails up. But it's only once the quarter actually hits the table or I catch it in my hand, does it actually become one or the other.
Yeah, but I think superposition goes a little bit more than that.
It really depends upon the interpretation that you have. So I think from the Copenhagen interpretation, they kind of leave it up in the air. Like they're not going to make any sort of they're just gonna it's kind of an unknowable thing at this point until we actually make a measurement. And then once we make a measurement, then we can know certain properties to the electron or the photon itself.
Well, that's why I say it's an interpretation that's on the table, that we and I agree. I mean, it hurts my head too. I think really, no, the cat is either alive or dead, and if you wait long enough, you're going to smell and figure that one out, right? Mm-hmm. But there are some interpretations where, it's both. So my point is more just that we're constantly observing patterns and we're constantly trying to derive models that let us predict the future. And that's what math, I think, is. And that's what all these things are. It doesn't mean that the patterns exist in a more fundamental way. It's our mind's observations of the stuff that's out there that lets us, and because that stuff is regular and seems to operate consistently, that we can devote these patterns. And now maybe we just have the benefit, I think, of a few hundred more years than these guys. But I mean, even just look at lasers and telescopes, and at each engineering development that makes them better and more precise, we get higher resolutions of all of this stuff that, so we can see things that they never could see before. We can see things at a micro scale that Kant could only have dreamed of, right? And so we're constantly revising our
so our I guess I'm not exactly sure of what the criticism is. Is it something like they maybe the position that we're at now is we're more, I don't know, we're less bothered by uncertainty, maybe, that maybe people like Descartes or Kant might have had?
Well, the way it seems to be describing is that that our mind is what is creating the structure around us, rather than interpreting the structure around us. I mean, to me, I think we're interpreting the structure around us rather than creating, The mind isn't imposing a structure; it's interpreting the structure that we find ourselves in. And that's what I don't quite. I mean, we can talk about romanticism. This is one thing I know I studied these things 20 years ago, but it's been way too long. You know, I don't really get this sense of just seeing it that the mind, you know, as we get further into irrationality, we're more in contact with reality.
Right. Yeah. So
I don't get.
yeah, there's a point like using Kant's kind of model as there are certain constraints to our experience of the world, and by delving further and further into like what are those constraints and trying to better understand them, it's less so that we're getting a clearer picture of what reality is, and more so we're getting a clearer picture of what the constraints of our thinking is. So it's less that we're knowing more about reality, we're just learning more about, oh, this is a like limitation to the human mind. And the way in which to sort of flip that so that we're actually getting a better understanding of reality is to, I guess, sort of play around with the unthinkable. So like kind of like what we were doing just a second ago in trying to think about a world in which the law of non-contradiction is not a law, but rather is like there are contradictions that can take place within reality, which is kind of like hard to really imagine. But that's where the romantics kind of like say that we're getting a more clear apprehension of reality, because we're sort of stepping outside of our very systematic constraints that we're trying to box the world into, and we're actually using our imagination to kind of give us the beginning framework to think about things in ways that we might not have been able to think about otherwise. So like just to go into the French Revolution, because that was very much tied out of the Romantics. It is to like, if there is a like social constraint where you cannot imagine a world in which the people rule over the government, rather they're like if you lived within a monarchy your entire life, you would have this, oh, this is the way in which the world must be, because there is a king and because he provides resources to us as people. This is the way it must be. But by providing some sort of like idealistic, imaginative story that can provide the shift in the people.
But that's purely in the realm of social construct, right? Government is social construct. Politics are social constructs. You know, the way we organize ourselves are social constructs. That seems to be a hard right turn from
like reality itself.
Objective reality outside the mind. I mean, of course, social constructs are mind dependent. Yes, the king, there's no inherent reason that this one person should control everything, or there's no inherent reason why certain individuals should be rich and others poor. So we can imagine a different social structure that changes that.
Without the position that you're in right now is able to see those things as social constructs. But prior to the position that we're in now, those things were very much connected to the metaphysical understanding of reality, where there are the, like, say, the Brahma caste, where the reasons that they're in positions of power is due to their nature or of what they've done in past lives. These are very much connected to the way in which they understood reality to be. Same way where the reason a person is a king is because they had God shining it down upon them and giving the sort of divine blessing upon them.
It's always interesting. Like, I never know quite what perspective we should take in analyzing these things? Should we be analyzing romanticism from the viewpoint of somebody who existed back then, or should we be analyzing their claims in the context of what we know today? And what can we take from romanticism or any of these ideas and apply today? I tend to I guess more do the latter, thinking, I'm trying to find, what can we take or discard? But I think they're both more. No, I get it, and that's what I was saying. We have a few hundred more years of standing on the shoulders of giants to learn from and figure out a lot of this stuff. I mean, what people like Kant and Hegel and these guys did without all that is incredible. So I mean, it's amazing what they did, but there's certain information they didn't have. But I mean, this romanticism where it's the world is an empty canvas on which imagination presses itself out, seems to mix it up a bit. The fact that we don't have an unfiltered access to the world doesn't mean that it's blank and that we just can't experience it exactly as it is. We have to pass through the filter, but we're still passing it through the filter. And I think Vervaeke agreed. I mean, Vervaeke was saying the romantics are wrong and so
and the empiricists are wrong. So there's the two kind of warring ideologies at the time. There's the empiricists, where they believe that the mind is like this blank thing in which the world is just impressing itself onto. Like there's the impressions of the world, which like they automatically move through your eyes and then form into your head as concepts, and then they automatically like a Spinozistic ball bearings kind of rolling and bouncing off of each other. They cause you to act, where the mind is sort of a byproduct of reality, working on things. And then there's the romantics where the understanding of the world as kind of the inert space where we can project our own, I guess, intentions or understandings or interpretations of it out there, that like this is something of ourselves that we're kind of bringing forward and working with, rather than the world kind of, imposing itself into us.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and Vervaeke, he points out that both of these are false. So it'll be interesting to kind of get a better understanding of his position. And I think kind of like what you were saying, he's pointing out the truths to a lot of these philosophers, but also pointing out their limitations, which might be kind of maybe a way in which to understand him. I don't know how much he's a Hegelian, but at least maybe just because of the topic of the lecture itself, seeing a bit of Hegelianism in his sort of series that he's trying to work off of.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely takes the approach of Hegel that we should create our own myths, and I've been thinking that myself. I mean that makes sense. If we accept that myths do something aside from their historical accuracy, that they provide a role, then we can say yes, creating new myths is probably a good thing to do. And in fact, we do that. I mean, that's what Hollywood, I think, creates myths all the time. Our best movies, not just the action ones, but the ones that are the most thought-provoking, like The Matrix, for example, is a modern day myth, that makes people think in certain ways and has the capacity to affect change. Or I've just been catching up on what is it with the hackers? Mr. Robot. Which is, again, a series. I mean, it's sort of modern day myth making about, the roles of these structures that we have, and it does. These are shows or movies or shows that do force you in a way to rethink the patterns of society. So and it makes sense that what I think we're not doing as much is consciously creating myths, like consciously developing myths to show certain patterns. And maybe it's a lot harder. Maybe it works better when we do it just unconsciously. I don't know. I mean, if we try, will we will be too forced. I mean, are these things that have to come out of just experience and just unconsciously reflecting what we because we unconsciously produce these patterns, we don't distort them. Whereas if we tried to do it on purpose, we're probably going to get something that's over the top or too moralistic in a way, like, too almost condescending.
You probably won't like this, but I believe that there actually has been an attempt to create a new religion that was not necessarily a religion within just the last century, and that's being Scientology, where there are
sure, and parts of it are ridiculous, right?
Yeah, there are like legitimate myths being created, and
or
honestly,
Mormonism, right?
Yeah, and honestly, I think like within Scientology, there is a strong aspect of attempting to create psychological relief mechanisms for the people, which like a lot of at my limited understanding was sort of based on certain like psychological practices that were at least on the forefront of scientific understanding of the time. And he was just kind of creating, I guess, a mythological framework in which they could like make sense and kind of like build off of in a like a coherent, because that's kind of like what a mythology is a coherent worldview of all the of our practices and behaviors and our our social structures and all and our own like psychological existential angst and well-being within the world, and also like our like understanding of history and like what is the purpose of living and different things like that. They're all kind of like fitting together, where science might have the like a certain domain in which it's answering these types of questions. It's failing to answer the questions in which like, why am I alive? What is my purpose? What should I be doing? What ought I to do? And so a mythology kind of provides a coherent worldview that fits all those things together.
And my question is, why can't we, and I think we should, like, why can't we just create myths as myths? We don't have to necessarily dress them up in history as historical documents, as truth. We can, like, again, great works of fiction don't dress themselves up by truth, but we often say they contain truth. They've recognized something that's true, and I think, and I'm wondering, I should start catching up to where Vervaeke is now, but I'm wondering if that's what Vervaeke has in mind of creating new myths, but that are presented as myths that aren't noble lies, but they're presented as untrue truths,
right?
As morality tales or parables.
And I think there might be a basis for that. I'm not so sure, but there is at least certain like psychological experiments that, like, what is it? There's this clip from the. It is a psychological experiment where people are put into an empty room and told to go through a test, and it's a test in which cheating on the test would be super easy for them. Now, they go through for that, and some of them will go through and cheat just to make their score a little bit higher. Then they'll have other people go through the test, but prior to the test, they'll say, okay, in this empty chair here, this was the chair of somebody that had died in their house, and now there's a story about a ghost that was haunting the chair or something like that. And even if the person entering the test doesn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, they're going to go through and not cheat on the test, like at all.
I wonder if the results would be different, and I wonder if they did this, if they presented it as a true tale and then presented it as an untrue tale, if that changes anything.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think, okay, what is it? Darren Brown? Is that the name of the magician?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. The one I saw, like, he actually performed this test. And I think the way in which he told the participants, and of course it's like a reenactment of a psychological experiment for television. I think he said, like, there's really nothing here. I mean, it is just like nobody really believes in any of this, but still it had that like internal mechanism for the person in which, because there's this like idea of a phantom being or something watching your movements, it's like a automatic response, even if you don't believe that there's an actual ghost in the room that is constraining your behavior so that you'll behave more ethically.
But we do have a real life example of it, which is the New Testament, where yes, there's the historical part of it, or presented as history, but there's also the parables, which Jesus presents as mythical. Like he says these are parables, which I'm assuming he's saying this didn't really happen, but I'm giving an example, and those parables have just as much, effect as the rest. Or actually, I wonder, that'd be an interesting study. I wonder if they've studied, the effects of the parable lessons in the New Testament versus the lessons that come out of what's presented as history. I wonder if there's a difference in how they affect behavior.
I think one way in which it, like, maybe there's an added factor to the parables is the fact that they're being spoken of by what's within Christianity known to be the Son of God. And so if it was just some, say, moral philosopher of the time creating these parables to kind of make his points, but this moral philosopher ended up making certain declarations about himself being the Son of God and then ended up getting killed, and that was kind of the end to him, then perhaps this moral philosopher's kind of parables wouldn't have as much weight behind them.
Maybe, though. I mean, is that always in the front of, I mean, as a non-Christian, I mean, like, I read these stories and I think, oh yeah, I mean, there are some good lessons there. Or sometimes I think there are bad lessons there. But to me, it's not, I don't say because it's from the Son of God, there's a good lesson there. But I wonder, like, do people, like, I mean, people must,
that's true.
Lessons not just because they're from Jesus, but that there's some element of sense to them, right? That they,
Yeah, there's kind of this strange outgrowth, at least within my corner of the internet. I don't know how much it's actually anything further than that, of people that call themselves Christian atheists, which is sort of like, it seems like sort of following from Peterson, in which they don't really believe in God as an actual deity or even as Jesus as being divine or resurrecting or anything like that, but acting as if there is, say, like a heaven and a hell, and there is like something real to the real in the sense, real in a different sense than what is normally discussed within Christianity. But I don't know. It's an interesting phenomenon, I guess.
Well, I'm pretty convinced, even though he won't admit it, that Jordan Peterson technically is a non-believer. I'm pretty convinced of that. I mean, he's very cagey about it, but from what I think the reason he's cagey about it is because he doesn't want to alienate. He doesn't want to go to say, I don't really believe it. My whole point is to act as if. But that's, and I don't necessarily think something's wrong with that as long as you're not persecuting people. I mean, that's sort of a good excuse to take the good and ignore the bad, right? But there's the persecution aspects in some of these religions that we have to be careful of there. But I think, like, we should be able to say, hey, these are, like, I think by presenting them as modern day myths, as conscious myths, we can prevent to an extent the dogma that leads to the atrocities, where we say these are ideals that we should reach for. These are not the everything is just disaster if you don't follow them, and you are an evil person for not meeting the ideal. That's, I think, where a lot of the atrocities come from. And we get to that in Hegel, where he's saying, I've determined the ultimate philosophy, and all of history has been coming to this point, and I have discovered it. And then everyone else is saying, well, that's where you get the authoritarian saying, well, all of history has come to me, and Napoleon and Hitler, and so they're imposing their will because they have figured it all out. And that's the danger, where where you say, I
Right.
figured it all out. But
kind of like that Gnostic belief in like, I am the incarnation of all of history. I am the Kairos that is changing everything. And then because I'm this Kairos, that gives me justification to do whatever, I don't know, whatever history is causing me to bring forward.
That's what, like I get the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and that seems to be a useful framework. That being said, I don't think everything follows that pattern. Sometimes we don't always. Sometimes we just throw out the antithesis, where we just think it's just wrong. We don't always integrate it, or sometimes we do. I integrate a lot. I call it taking the good and throwing out the bad. So I think with the left
and even like within history, like you might have a thesis and an antithesis, but the thesis is so much more powerful than the antithesis that it just wipes them out. There's a genocide that takes place, and there's not actually any sort of synthesis that goes on. It's just a dying off of the antithesis for now.
So it takes a general pattern, which is useful to say this often happens, but makes it a dogma of this has to happen, and then this has to result in this synthesis until we get to really, he's almost, as Vervaeke was describing Hegel, he was almost describing enlightenment, the end of the cycle of birth and rebirth. That Buddha talked about, that it's the end of the cycle of suffering. That almost seems to be what Hegel is talking about, that at one point, with his thing, you have to have it. If it's always a cycle of antithesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, well, then it's a infinite, not regress, but whatever the opposite of a regress is going forward. It's infinite going forward. You always have to have a new antithesis and thesis, and so he's got to say, well, no, it's got to come to a point, an end point at some point. And of course, he identifies himself as that endpoint. Just coincidentally, he's the one who figured it all out.
Well, not necessarily himself, but at least the philosophy that he brings forward.
but that's where you get to dogma, when you make that assumption. Because once you get to the end, once you say this is it, this is the end result that history has brought us to, then you have to impose it on everyone, or else it's not the end result. It's not just one more step, So that's, I think that's where it gets to be this dangerous idea where, again, where they say it is on my shoulders to spread the truth of this way, because this is the truth with the capital T. This is the way with the capital W.
Kind of similar to, I guess, like the people that might undergo some sort of like spiritual or transcendent experience, and then that provides them with some sort of clarification for themselves that helps them to resolve any sort of suffering that they might be going through. If they were to then take this point of clarification and try to proselytize to all other people, they might be prescribing a medicine that was highly specific to their own situation and context, rather than prescribing the necessary medicine for all the other peoples with differing problems that they're undergoing and different contexts.
Right. And because really what that transcendent experience did is make them more comfortable with themselves and make them see themselves as fitting in the world. Whereas it may not fit to somebody else. Somebody else may not fit in that same way. They have a different agent arena experience.
Right. And it's not just them like coming like to a point of radical acceptance of themselves. Like there's people that go through DMT and then recognize just how much they are being self-destructive towards themselves. And they'll give up smoking after it. They'll be like and I think it's somehow connected to like them recognizing like the reasons that they were smoking, or at least this is the I guess experience that they go through, is a self-discovery that the reasons that they were smoking was due to some sort of inherent self-hatred towards themselves, and then being able to stop that self-hatred so that they could give up smoking.
And somebody else may have had a different suffering and a different issue. I mean,
because that's the thing. Like smoking is a fairly adequate stress relievers, and I think it's probably a very useful mitigation of stress for the people that are having to live like very stressful lives. I don't know, like people that are tax traders or not are stock traders. That might be a adequate avenue for stress relief. And of course, there's a lot of other avenues that they'll probably go down as well.
Yeah, go ahead. I was gonna say, it's funny how Vervaeke really hates romanticism. He hasn't come out so strongly against a philosophy, but his vitriol just came out at every statement. He calls romanticism the godfather of all pseudo-religious ideologies. That romantics didn't give us anything other than they, or what do you say, they gave us the language. They gave us a language and a poetry and art, but nothing else. That
right. Yeah, that's a good point. Like so far, he's been like hammering home the point that religions and these differing systems of meaning-making devices have been brought forward with some sort of basis of practice and self-transcendence and being able to involve oneself with one's community and world. Yeah, it provides for all of that. But for the romantics, there's kind of it's like lacking a lot of the necessary components to the kind of religion, like fully fledged out religions that have come before. And like, I would also include like Buddhism and Buddhist practices within this, where there is some sort of like living out rather than within romanticism, where it's just a follow after your own desires and wherever it may lead, and then be happy with that. There is one point he did make as like, I guess you could say as a good thing that the romantics kind of brought forward was there's the idea of the mind imposing itself onto reality is sort of part of the like very basis to the science of psychology, where psychology is recognizing that there are kind of the ways in which we're interpreting the world, which is not a accurate recognition of the world, but rather is due to some sort of neuroses within ourselves. So like that's where you get the Freudian conception of projection, where you're projecting some sort of feelings onto, or like you're projecting this idea that this person has feelings toward you, but that's not an accurate representation. That's just maybe your own insecurities. But
here's where I don't get, here's what I don't understand. Projection I get, because it's very clear that when I'm projecting, it's saying I am assuming something else is like I think it, but it's not really like I think it. Now, but that is saying the mind is imposing reality on the world almost seems that it's not just my interpretation, but it is actually creating reality. And that's where I take the issue. I think projection makes sense. I think a certain way, so I project that you think this way when you may think a completely different way. But the fact is, you may think a completely different way. My projection didn't create how you actually think. It just creates my thoughts about my impression of how you think.
Right. And I think the romantics aren't like trying to impose like what reality actually is. Like for the romantics, like the hard romantics, what reality actually is sort of irrelevant. So they might have this like I still haven't seen the movie Her, but that to me seems like a kind of articulation of like, even though it is the fact that the AI doesn't have any sort of emotional feelings towards the human, there's a way. I haven't seen the ending, so I'm not sure what the actual conclusion of the movie is. But just using it as sort of a standpoint, like you could have this idea that I have this romantic relationship with this vampire or something like that, in which we make love every night, something like that. And the fact that vampires don't exist is sort of irrelevant to the hard romantic, because there is this experience of love and romance, of actual romance taking place, even though there's no recipient nor I don't know, feedback.
But they do have, but they do have a real feeling, right?
Right.
There is some reality there in that the feeling is real, and they may say, I don't know, I don't know about this. They may say it's worth it because I love that feeling is so great. He talks about like the romantic movies, or he really hates, I guess, romantic comedies. I think because he thinks they really cheapen and they're so unrealistic, and it's true, they create this unrealistic version. But people do have these feelings while they watch them that they really like and they really enjoy. And,
sorry. There's a good point that he had made about like, because romanticism is sort of like the chasing after this feeling, and it's not connected to any of the other, like, I guess, anchoring components that like religions and other psychotechnologies had. Then like the movies, like into comedies that say that happiness is being in love with people and having a relationship with people, is it's putting all of these components that were previously held within your social structure that you're within onto the other person, and you have to like use this other person as this self-transcendent mechanism to become better and live that life. And it's very much like, especially since people are fallible and they're not able to kind of work with all of that. It's like having two blind people trying to build each other up into becoming less blind.
But see, this is the problem I have with isms, that when you have these isms, I think isms are useful to help us categorize, talk about, an envelope of ideas. But the problem is when we say we should only follow this ism. I mean, to me, it seems like Vervaeke's point is we need balance. I mean, we need, that intellectual, propositional, rational type side is important, but we also need this perspectival, participatory side. We don't want, saying that the propositional side is good does not mean the perspectival, participatory side is bad. And what we want is balance. We put too much of our eggs in one basket or another. Some people, are purely perspectival and participatory. Other people are purely propositional. And what we want is both.
Yeah, we want some sort of system that provides for both, and in such a way that we can kind of like build off of ourselves. And so, yeah, it would be very interesting to see like how a system, like it seems that Vervaeke is at least kind of setting up the foundations for that will provide a lot of these, or ideally provide these sorts of necessary mechanisms for a religion that's not a religion.
Yeah, for sure. All right, what we can get into Schopenhauer, so who he calls the godfather of nihilism, and this is where he's talking about the will to live, which he calls the raw drive. So that we have this will to live, to procreate, I guess. We just have these instincts to do stuff, and that's not rational. That are instinctual.
It's something that isn't necessary. Like it is an arbitrary will that we have. It's not like connected to anything that is legitimate or anything like that. It is simply a fact that you exist within a world in which you are going to die, and you have this instinctual drive to, despite that, live. And because you cannot live to the fullest extent that you will to do so, like you want to have sex with everything, you want to eat and drink and build yourself up to be the most powerful organism you can be. The fact that reality itself is not conducive to that, it is it is what lends oneself towards nihilism, to where the kind of like rational conclusion one can make would be either suicide or antinatalism, because antinatalism and Schopenhauerian nihilism are very much connected, as well as like within Buddhism, like what we were discussing with Nick last week, that there's within at least classical Buddhism, it's the drive to finalize, like to exit out of life and this constant cycle of rebirth and karmic cycles of being gods and then being men. To finally leave that, because it's ultimately for naught.
And it's another place where I wonder, like, why they have to have either or and rather than and. Like, why is the fact that we have these drives, which are biologically based, and I'm sure we didn't probably have as firm an understanding of evolutionary processes as we do now, but so we have these drives, and yes, we have this gut instinct to survive, and it seems that all living things seem to have this to one extent or another. But why does that mean life is meaningless? Why does that mean we are also conscious creatures with intelligence, with the capacity for joy, for meaning, for all this stuff? It just seems to me to be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, yes, we have some parts of us that are instinctive, and we have other parts. I mean, even meaning, I think, to some extent, is involuntary, even in the way that we talk about, that Vervaeke talks about, these psychotechnologies, that these psychotechnologies put us in a position to have meaningful insight, but they're not voluntary. We don't just decide to have meaning. He's sort of gaming our biological drives, our biological mechanisms, figuring out psychotechnologies that harness our mechanism that produce this meaning, this sense of meaning. So I don't know why it necessarily goes to nihilism, which just seems to imply there's no meaning. Obviously, there's meaning. I mean, maybe this is too simple, but we have intelligence, we have thoughts, we have this sense of meaning. That is meaning. It doesn't have to have, whether or not the universe as a whole has some plan, doesn't mean life is meaningless. It's meaningful if we are meaning-led creatures.
Yeah, and it seems like there's differing shades of nihilism, where, like, I think it's almost like it's not the best portrayal of Schopenhauer to just call him a nihilist. I think pessimist is more so a better label for him, where sure, there is meaning, but the meaning is such that life is evil, or existence is suffering, like the Buddha's noble truth, and like the basis for that, for the reason that life is suffering, is because we have inbuilt desires within us that are ultimately unable to be satisfied. Like you cannot, like, you have the will to live, and then you do the thing, and that satisfied the will to live. It's always going to be with you, and it can never be satisfied. And since you're going to die, it's going to be ultimately not negated, but it's going to just leave you, like, all of existence, because it's not going to be satisfied, is going to be either the drive that to satisfy this desire to maximize your own self, or the suffering that is there in the recognition and realization that it's not actually going to be satisfied.
Yeah, like the way I think of it is, we have, yes, there's a lot of suffering, but there's also joy, there's also happiness, there's also, again, meaning, that, and I think the way we tend to think of it is those periods of meaning and joy outweigh, make up for the suffering that they provide. That is our reason to keep on going, because we can have those wonderful experiences, and I think that's part of our goal, is to have those wonderful experiences. Even the religious, even the concept of heaven is to have eternal salvation, eternal bliss, right? It's that yes, we have the suffering, but the good parts make up for it.
Yeah, that's the difference. Well, I don't know if it's so much that they make up for it. I guess you can think of it in a way. It's like, yes, there is suffering in life, but it's only temporary suffering, and it will be ultimately made right. All tears will be stopped in the end. Hi, Smith. You want to mention something?
Yeah. So just wanted to make a point. These good experiences, right? They don't have to be some sort of religious experience or some kind of, I don't know, fancy experience. It can be something as simple as for example, what I do is like when I'm having a bad day, and so I'm like, but I want to go on living because I just want to go home and play uh, Grand Theft Auto or something, or
Mhm.
spend some time with friends. So I sometimes they can just be normal things that you like to do.
Right.
Yeah,
And that can be meaningful. That can be deeply meaningful too. I mean, that can, yeah, that can provide you that provides us with the will to sort of go on, so to speak.
I can't recall exactly which philosopher. It might have been C.S. Lewis. It might have been Albert Camus. But it it's sort of there are multiple strategies in which one can adopt in response to the problem of suffering. Like the fact that you exist and pain is sort of pain or suffering or hardships are a prerequisite to existing. There are certain like prescriptions that you can take in order to deal with this problem, because like insofar as pain is experienced as a negative, it's something that we avoid. There's ways in which like what is the rational option to take due to this fact of nature, and they're like, what is it? Camus' like ultimate question, like the only philosophical question worth asking and answering is whether or not one should commit suicide. And the reason, like the very reason that one might commit suicide is due to the fact that like your life will be ultimately less good than it should be. Like we have some sort of idea of like from a Schopenhauerian perspective, we have this will to live a life that will not actually be achieved because I don't know, we have this will to be a great man, but we're in such a situation that we're not able to actually achieve it. So yeah, suicide is one option that you could take due to the problem of suffering. The other is, I think, Camus' kind of absurdism, where despite the fact that there is suffering in life, we can make do. We can kind of like make do with the happiness and joy that is within life, and just focus on that, sort of in a hedonistic approach. And it's not like hedonism in a bad way, but like
right, yeah, hedonism
accepting.
has
Yeah.
this implication of just people having sex parties and stuff, but
Yeah. Accepting that, we're like this absurdism, or it's not necessarily absurdism, but like holding that the pleasure that one has in life is worth whatever suffering one might have to go through in order to get to it. Like I don't know, say like pleasure or joy has a 2x rating compared to pain that
right.
And that would be a justification for living. And I don't know, those might be, or of course I guess the Schopenhauer kind of perspective, where it's or it's not necessarily Schopenhauer, but well, yeah, I guess the Buddhist or Schopenhauer or David Benatar kind of perspective, where yes, we recognize suffering is a negative, and it would be better if people didn't have to undergo any of these sorts of negatives due to the fact that life is such that it will not satisfy you. Then we shouldn't cause life to exist any further within reality.
I mean, and the other way to look at it, though, is like we've hit the existence lottery. Like we are one of the few of the potential infinite number of existing things or creatures or whatnot that exist. We have the opportunity to have experiences. Once we're dead, let's just say if there's no afterlife, this is our only opportunity to have experiences, and we will never have those opportunities again. I think Vervaeke said, I forget if it was Kant or Hegel, or which one of them was saying, or maybe it was just Nietzsche, who we'll come to in a bit. What's the difference in having it for 40 years or one day as a fly? Well, in our 40 or 80 now years of life, we get a lot more experiences. We have a lot more of these opportunities to have good experiences and to have meaningful experiences.
Right.
Whereas once we're dead, we get none of that.
Yeah, and that's actually where I like Nietzsche's kind of response to Schopenhauer. Is like Schopenhauer is still relying upon this sort of like Christian morality of self-negation, or where like Nietzsche can kind of like say, okay, yeah, we have this will to live, but this is like who we are. Why? Like, I mean, this is something that like we have this will to live, and we're living. Like this is like what we get it. This is what like what else would you want? Because we're actually getting exactly like we're doing the thing in which we're willing towards, and we're able to kind of sort of achieve it. Now, going back to Schopenhauer for a second, I do think that there is a I guess benefit within sort of the Christian worldview, or even just theistic worldview in general, where the wills that are implanted within us are directly connected to some sort of end that will be achieved. And you can kind of think of this in an Aristotelian sense, that there is a teleological inclination towards within creatures that is the thing in which they are drawn towards is an actual thing in which they will receive. So within like Christian theism, like we have a natural inclination or desire for the good, which is God, and that will be our ultimate end. And like the purpose of life is to kind of prepare yourself for that once it happens. But with the I guess disharmonious nature to Schopenhauer's kind of like understanding, or even kind of like the materialistic understanding, that the wills that are implanted into us have no direct relation to what they are capable of achieving. Like it may be the case that because the desire to mate with the most sexually attractive female, it was a evolutionarily successful inclination, that this inclination was delivered into all the creatures in it, and so they're going to be at a position of dissatisfaction because they're not able to actually achieve the things. And especially the fact that we're presented with all these things that we cannot have, like there's several studies. I don't know the legitimacy of all of them because there's been several contentions about it. But the fact that there's a high degree of depression within teenagers, and there's some loose correlation, I guess, with like the rise of social media and like Instagram. And on an anecdotal scale, I can recognize that, yes, by having a constant barrage of people living out these perfect lives that they're presenting for themselves on social media, it's kind of putting me into a position of, why am I not living that perfect life?
An Instagram where it's all filtered and even fake, not just filtered, they edit it to make their bodies look different. Photoshop or they don't even need Photoshop anymore. There's like $5 apps that can reshape your body in a picture. Mm-hmm. And so what the answer to that is to show them that it is not real. Is to
but that's the thing. If our desires are based in irrationality anyways, then showing them that it's not real doesn't necessarily change the will. Because
doesn't it? Because isn't there a participatory aspect of that? Isn't there a grasping of that when you see? Maybe you can't just tell them it's not real, but you have to show them it's not real. For example, there was this a few months ago. There was this Instagram or not this YouTuber or Twitch person or whatever who had this video of her dog playing with her dog, and she screwed up, and she showed the unedited clip where she then, I forget her name, but she was like hitting the dog.
Right.
And so this whole image she presented herself was a fraud, and people suddenly saw this in a very visceral way. So that I think if you just tell them it's not here's an example that I've done to my kids, and I think it's been effective, but I don't know, maybe some people disagree. I remember, for example, when I was a kid and I did a project on smoking, at grade 6, and what I had to do was go to the lung society, and I got all these pictures of blackened lungs, and it had a very strong effect on me that stopped me, I think, from becoming a smoker. What I've done with my kids, for example, one of my sons had a habit of running out into the road. I went and found pictures online of kids who had been in car accidents, and not the most gross ones, but showing kids in the hospital and saying, this is what can happen. And it had a very strong effect. I think a participatory effect, or not participatory, but more.
Yeah,
it is, because he saw the image and he could then just telling him,
like he can kind of draw that connection between himself and that child. Yeah.
Right. So there's some of these Instagram stars who have said, okay, here's my real picture versus the touch picture to actually show that they're not real. So there's a participatory way we can impart this knowledge rather than just saying it's, hey, it's not real. We have to show, because that's how we grasp things in that sort of gnosis type way, that you can't really get it until you, or maybe it's like the psychotechnology where it's not quite participating in it, but it's a step closer than just being told it when you see it visually.
Okay, so that'll be a interesting thing I'll have to kind of like think about, because there are multiple differing philosophies in which the will is kind of based in irrationality, where it doesn't have to correlate with any sort of real thing that in reality. And then there are the more, I guess, maybe Platonic ways of conceiving of will, as there is some sort of end that it's driven towards. And it's interesting to think like it is a fact. I don't know, maybe this is just for myself, and it might not be the case for other people, but if I have some sort of desire towards a thing, and then if I or somebody else manages to explain how the desire that I have to a thing is unable to be achieved, that lessens the degree to my desire. It might have to be connected to some other thing. Like, okay, you had the desire for X, but in order to achieve X, you would have to like spend all of your money, devote an entire 10 years of your life in order to get this. And the fact that you're not doing this is an indication that you don't really desire this thing that much. So why don't you instead focus, what are the things that are actually within your grasp? And then that would be something in which you can kind of direct your desires in alignment with your current circumstances. I think there is sort of a difference where if our desires are based in rationality, then towards what is real, and versus whether our desires are based within irrationality, that there are certain conclusions that might be, I don't know. Okay, because like within Schopenhauer, our desires are based in irrationality, but Nietzsche, our desires are also based in irrationality, and that's not necessarily a problem for Nietzsche, but it is for Schopenhauer. So there might be
and what do we mean by irrationality? Like irrationality can sometimes be almost seen as illogical, but it can also be seen as sort of qualia based. Like, I'm the feeling like emotionally of pleasure, based. Right. The feeling of pleasure, you could say, is irrational. It's not a logical argument that I've reached. It's a feeling that I like, and suffering is a feeling I don't like. And so you could say both of those are irrational, but our reactions to it can be rational or irrational. Like, do we mean that anything that is not reason based is irrational? Is that what we mean by irrational, or do we mean irrational as a negative thing?
Our
instinctive will to live is not rational because it's below reason. It's deeper than reason. We don't think it through. It just is. Now, isn't just is. There's all sorts of biological mechanisms that lead us to that, but it's not that we've thought it through to get there. It's not based on logic.
Right. So within the Aristotelian or Platonic understanding of desires or inclinations, it is based within, there is a the capacity to achieve these desires, that what like the acorn being drawn towards becoming a tree, it is something that is actually capable of being achieved given a set of circumstances that could be fulfilled. So like I might have the desire to have a bowl of ice cream tonight, but there's no bowl of ice cream in the house that I'm aware of. So I would have to go out and get some. But it's like if this desire that I had was for something that could not be achieved, then that would be, at least within the Platonic understanding or Aristotelian or Stoic understanding, be an irrational desire or a passion, which I think is what the Stoics refer to it as. Whereas with like the more, I guess, nominalistic understandings of desires and instincts, these passions do not necessarily have to correlate with any sort of real end that they can achieve. Like it could be the case that I'm born with instinctive desires for things that I will unable to be achieved nor satisfy.
Yeah, but we can also, like, we can modify our desires, maybe not directly, but indirectly we can. Like you said, in becoming convinced that the desire is unachievable, it reduces your
inclination towards it.
And it's not that you decided to be less inclined to it, but the realization, by taking a rational analytical approach to it, it affects sort of through a roundabout way your desire. And so maybe we should be talking about irrational things rather than irrational things.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good distinction, I think, because like within the nominalistic understandings of desires, the irrationality is sort of irrelevant, or it doesn't even make sense to refer to it as irrational because it's not referring to anything. It's not like there is something real and it's referring to something that's not that thing. It's just there is no referent that it's actually connected towards. Like it's just an emotional feeling. And then from that feeling, there are multiple ways in which we can prescribe action to satisfy that feeling. And it's not like that feeling was directly connected to any of those ends. It's just any of those ends could satisfy that feeling. So like if you have hunger, the eating of Chinese food, pizza, or porridge, these are all ends in which could satisfy that feeling within you.
Although some of those feelings could have negative results, like I could have Fruit Loops, which would taste really good going down, but then have negative side effects that cause more suffering later, versus eating something healthy, which would have positive impacts later. And I'm a big experiencer of taking the short term.
Yeah, and that's a good point. That like you can make your decisions in regards to the immediate feelings with like a low time preference, or the other, like making your decisions in regards to the feelings that we're also going to have in the future with sort of a high time preference, or like ideally what choices can be made that can satisfy me now and in the future and also satisfy other people as well.
So yeah, it's all this there's this interplay between, and that's why I don't know why it has to be this all or nothing with these guys. It doesn't have to be like they seem to just want to go to one extreme or the other, because why not just recognize there's an interplay between the different sides?
Yeah, I wonder if it's part of the aspect of being a philosopher. Like,
yeah,
you're reading all these monumental figures, and each of them had their own like prominent ideas in which they kind of planted this flag on a mountain that is their own thing. And maybe because you kind of find such a deep honor or reverence towards these people that you kind of want to kind of build your own mountain that you can place your flag upon to share in the limelight. But I think it is sort of this active seclusion that kind of puts you into a position of I guess putting blinders on yourself to a lot of these other things in such a way that you're not going to be able to kind of see it.
Well, it's like this, and this is where I'm not quite sure where Vervaeke is going. Like, I'm convinced that the psychotechnologies lead to positive results, but I'm not quite sure how to categorize them. I'm not quite sure they're accurately categorized as becoming closer in touch with reality. Like, why can't we think of these as providing a deep sense of meaning and satisfaction without it necessarily being a deeper sense of reality? Like, why do we have to go that far? Why can't we just say that's a really good thing that these great results happen? Because it seems like a stretch. Like it seems like without applying reason to them, we can't assess how close to reality they are. And we can separate our positive results, our positive participatory feeling from whether they are actually providing us with knowledge or like, I think they're providing us something different than knowledge. And then why do we need to use the word reality? Why can't we just say they're great? And you're going to be really happy and satisfied with your life with a great sense of well-being if you participate in these psychotechnologies.
Yeah, that's a way in which we can think about these philosophies, not in regards to how accurate they are or how viable their models are towards reality, but more so in regards to what do they do? Like, this is a good tool that I as a human being can utilize for living.
Right.
And like, this is an actual, like, as a technology. And it would be sort of a weird thing to say that this hammer corresponds well with reality, or this saw corresponds well with reality. But thinking of it like, I mean, in a certain way, our thoughts and our practices are like tools that we use as organisms in our human interactions. Like, language is a tool I'm using to kind of communicate my mind into your mind in a sort of way.
And it's not to denigrate searching for reality. I'm a huge fan of it. I think
I'm a fan of reality too.
No, but what I'm saying is to say that these psychotechnologies and this meaning is not about reality is not to say finding reality isn't important. It's just saying it's something different. In addition to searching for truth and reality, we also want to have mental well-being. And these psychotechnologies can help provide that in a scientifically evidenced way.
Right.
I guess we have to wait to hear, but it seems like Vervaeke seems to need it to be some connection to a deeper reality. And I'm not sure why. It's all the stuff that he talks about makes them really worth pursuing without mentioning the word reality.
I think you're right, because his, at least so far in how he's formulating the genealogy of the meaning crisis, is in regards to all these philosophers were trying to get a better apprehension of reality. And it seems like from within at least the rationalists in sort of the modern sense that we use it, that is also a strong inclination that we have, is to know what is real and to build our mythology or our worldview only off of those things. Because it's like even within Plato, there is the like morally permissible noble lie that can take place, and like within other philosophies, there are like certain areas in which you can kind of have a little leeway with what the truth is. I don't know if Vervaeke, in his attempt to build a religion that's not a religion, will have these sorts of areas in which the reality behind the thing is not as important. Like, if everything has to have some sort of basis, then
he mentions this experiment that he does with his class every year, where he says, how many of you would prefer to know that your partner was cheating on you, even though it's going to destroy your sense of your relationship and going to cause deep suffering? And most people say yes, they would prefer to know, because we have some instinctual sense of wanting to know what is real. But that's a separate question for are we actually happier? Would we actually be better off not knowing when our partners betrayed us? Like, could we actually have a better life at the end without that suffering? And now I'm not saying this rhetorically. I still have that same instinct that I would rather know, but I think we have to ask the question: is that the most important thing? Like, and the answer is not necessarily obvious, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. This might be tangential to the point you were making, but there's I think something that Nietzsche points out about Schopenhauer, that Schopenhauer has this sort of derision towards the deluded masses, that they are happy just living their life without mindlessly, just kind of as a farmer, things like that. But yet there is still, like, Schopenhauer recognizes that there's the will to happiness, or the will to life within every man. But yet he himself is not willing to live that deluded life. Like, for him, it is better to be that pessimistic philosopher, just writing alone and writing his books to the public, than it is to be that living the life. And so, like, it sort of seems like, at least as an observer, that his articulation of the will to life, or the will to live, it is, I don't know, like, he himself is almost like a example, a counter example to what this all purpose will to live is within everyone, because he's somebody that will to live a life in which it, like, he's not really getting that much out of it. He's living in depression and like hatred for a lot of humanity.
But part of the answer may be that we have to broaden our experience of well-being and what's important, that there can be a deep satisfaction in piercing through the veil of delusion, or the veil of illusion, I would say, more than delusion, that in figuring things out, even if it may make you feel bad in some ways, there's a deep sense of satisfaction there. And I suspect that's what, or I would say that to myself. I mean, I think in some respects, not thinking about all these things can be a lot simpler, and maybe lead to, like, I think having a simplistic life may be a lot happier than overthinking everything. Right. But I would still choose, like, to me, it's almost like a whimsical what if, but I'm not changing the way I do things, because I think, hey, it could be, I mean, there's something in me that has to press into these things and overthink everything. I can't just decide to not do that. It's sort of
right.
Did someone join us?
Oh, yeah, I just added Tyler. Sorry, Tyler. I don't know how long you were waiting there. It doesn't give me any, like, notification or doorbell or anything. So sorry, but
yeah, we got to figure out.
We've already spoken for about 2 hours. I was thinking maybe like another half hour, since we haven't even talked about Hegel yet at all. Yeah. I didn't really have much notes on Hegel, and I think you had maybe more so. But there's something that you were just maybe this is a reach, but perhaps the fact that our inclinations towards things can be dissuaded due to like me telling you, oh, this is something that cannot really be achieved. Like, say, if I had the inclination to marry Kendall Jenner and become like the spouse of a billionaire, and then you like, I had this grand idea to marry Kendall Jenner, like, I have the proposal and everything worked out, and you went through, like, man, he's just gonna, like, fall on his face. Let me explain to you how all these things are gonna fail. Like I think she's already married or in a relationship or something already. So, like, you would have to, like, break that up, and you wouldn't want to break that up. There's all these, like, avenues in which you would try to make a rational case against my inclinations. And I at least do see that these are persuadable. Now, of course, you made the good kind of, like, and the point I was making with that, it is lending, I think, more support towards the model that our desires are based in some sort of sense of what is real. Like we're more inclined towards what is real than we are towards what is not real. And of course, this is only referring to our sense of what is real, not necessarily to what is real.
Right. And our comfort with that, which is why, again, I wonder why, with all these benefits of these psychotechnologies, how Vervaeke makes the link to it's more in contact with what is real. That's just there's just
right.
that stuff I think is missing that I'm not sure how he gets there or what we mean by real in that sense.
Yeah.
You know, it's like we're perceiving a different pattern, but whether we're accurately perceiving that pattern or not isn't the what makes the positive effect. It's that by perceiving the patterns differently, it's having a better effect on our mental well-being.
Right. It's the psychological experience of something being real. It doesn't necessarily have to correlate with it actually being real.
Right. And that's positive whether or not we have correctly identified that pattern, as long as it's not providing some other horrible harm, I guess would be the
right. So this is an interesting thought that I just had over the course of this conversation is for the hard-nosed Kantian that does believe that there is a noumenal realm in which we have no capacity to find out anything about it. Whether whether that makes a difference in like belief in God in some sense, like you might believe in God but realize there's absolutely no way in which you can get any sort of rational argumentation or even okay, well, maybe this is the point then, because if you accept Kant's phenomenal and noumenal distinction, then and you have no phenomenal experience of God, then all there would be some sort of noumenal, or God would only exist within the noumenal and would be constantly outside of our reach. Maybe that's where we can get into Hegel, because it seems like there's some sort of connection to what is real due to the fact that it like produces outcomes. Like what was it? We kind of brought it up earlier that Hegel says that if we have no way of knowing any features to what is noumenal, like it is outside of all experience at all, it's as if it doesn't exist. Like we can't even differentiate something that doesn't exist and something that we cannot have any method of apprehending.
Yeah, so Vervaeke, as Vervaeke describes it, Hegel says the thing in itself is completely unknowable, and that makes it indistinguishable from being non-existent. And I agree to an extent that if we can't know anything about something, then it makes it indistinguishable to us from being non-existent. But the question is it true that we can't know anything about, like completely unknowable seems like a big stretch. Completely knowable, I agree. If he said the thing in itself cannot be completely knowable to us, I would agree.
But if Kant said that,
yeah, or if Hegel, or either of them, whatever. But Hegel is saying the thing in itself is completely unknowable, which seems like a big stretch, unless you're going to, again, as I said earlier, unless you're going to say knowability means 100% certainty without any chance of being wrong. Because here's the thing, like I say, like if we have evidence of something existing, even though it's not certain, that does make it distinguishable from if we had zero evidence of something existing. There's some planet, 20,000 light years away from us. Yeah, we have no evidence of it. It has no noticeable impact on our lives. We have no way of knowing anything about it. For us, it's indistinguishable from that planet not existing. But there's billions of planets out there that we have no information about whatsoever because we can't see them, except maybe we can see the stars near them. That's the most we have.
Right. And I like, there's a sense in which I agree with Hegel, kind of following from William James' pragmatism, that if there's like no way of differentiating a thing and its opposite, or a thing in its lack of existence, then either proposition is acceptable. Really, the only differentiation that could be made was due to what are the psychological benefits, or what affordances are we provided by accepting one or the other.
Right. But that to
so,
me
Tyler,
is distinguishable.
I asked Tyler what was going on since we couldn't see him or hear him, and he responded, "Merely phenomenal technical difficulties. I assure you, my noumena is quite intact." Good to hear, Tyler. Thank you.
So, see, to me, I get that, but as long as we're not saying that it's an ontological distinction, if we could say it's a practical distinction, I'm 100% on board. But we can't make an argument that not knowing about something makes it ontologically not existent. And I mean, that's just a fallacy, right? It's just, it doesn't flow from the fact that I know nothing about X therefore does not exist.
Unless we're also claiming that we're omniscient. So anything that we do know must exist. Sure. And if it's something that we don't know, then it must not exist. Yeah.
So, I agree. And, but then, so then what Vervaeke says is, so if nothing can be known about it, he says, stop thinking about it as something that exists. And if we remove the thing in itself, then we get idealism. Reality is found only in the mind. And that to me is a leap I can't get to. I accept it as a possibility. I accept idealism as absolute idealism as a possibility, meaning it's on the table, but I grant it fairly low plausibility.
It seems like there's multiple models in which can accurately, or that can fit our understandings of reality, and that would fit one of them. There's no logical contradictions within it that we can think of right now.
But there seems to be a much greater weight of evidence on the fact that the external world does exist, that while we cannot know everything about this stuff, we can know some things. And even if they're approximations, they're pretty damn good ones that allow a tremendous amount of use. They're very practical to us. So it's like, again, they're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Because I can't know everything about something, therefore I might as well know nothing about them. No, that's wrong.
Also, I just thinking about this right now, if our basis for what is real is dependent upon what is subjectively apprehended, it seems very hard to make any sort of disagreement with somebody as to what is real, because they're going to be experiencing something, let's say I say or you say something about my intelligence or something like that, and I might take that as a slight that you're committing towards me, whereas there was no such intention within yourself. But due to the fact that I apprehended it as a slight within subjective idealism, this might be almost like it would almost be irrational to argue over whether or not the slight was a accurate representation of reality, because it's only referring to the thing, to the experience of the thing itself, rather than the thing itself.
So Tyler, are you muted, or are you not able to talk? Is
I guess issues with he sometimes has issues with his microphone.
We can't hear him. So
might
Tyler might as well not.
Yeah, for all intents and purposes for the stream, because you cannot see his little logo here, then for the stream, Tyler does not exist.
Okay, so here's my question. This to me is obvious. This to me isn't that controversial. So why is Hegel, who's clearly more brilliant than me, creating this whole system of absolute idealism, and that reality is only the rational, and our mind is making the structure of reality itself? There's something I'm missing, whether it's just in the way Vervaeke presented it, or because to be fair, he was trying to distill a whole body of work to just the parts that are relevant to us and in like less than half an hour. So, you know, I'm not
Right.
knocking Vervaeke here. You know, it was a mammoth task because, you know, I think you really need like 5 lectures on Hegel to really get at
Yeah.
even, you know, to
What
really get at any of this.
What I wish Vervaeke might have brought up a little bit more is like the phenomenological understanding of reality that's within Hegel, as far as I'm understanding it. And it might be, at least my understanding of the concept of phenomenology, and then the description of Hegel's kind of philosophy, I can kind of see the connection where the reason Hegel is sticking within only what is subjectively experienced is due to kind of his very basis of disregarding the noumenon, is because there is no other causal force that is interacting within our reality or our existence. Like if the noumenon has no causal elements that or no practical.
Sorry, wait, just define noumenal again.
Yeah, so the noumenal is the thing in itself. So there's the like it, from the materialist understanding, it's the object itself as it exists, independent of what it looks like, how big it is, the shape of it, the color, the weight, all these phenomenal distinctions that we have for the thing. And so like once you kind of strip away every single phenomenal understanding of a thing, you're kind of left with nothing that we can at least
I hear you, but it's the way I see it is that our weight is an approximation. It's a model. It's a description of something that's meant to help us understand a certain property. You know, speed, velocity, all these physical laws, all these physical characteristics are our models to explain what's out there. So it's not to say that those physical aspects don't exist, but they don't exist exactly as we're describing it. When we describe weight, 100 pounds, that is not the thing we're describing. It's a way of imagining it. It's a way of understanding.
Right. And I'm not meaning it like that. It's the weight, as in this feels like I experience pressure when I try to move this thing, whereas I experience very little pressure when I try to move this smaller thing.
So why would we eliminate, to say that we can't understand those exactly as they are? Why would we just eliminate them from consideration entirely? Why wouldn't we say, well, we can't understand them exactly as they are, but there is something that we are describing there. We're just not getting it bang on. So I agree. If we got rid of every property about a thing, we're left with nothing. But why should we get rid of those properties?
Yeah. And like, that's why we're only focusing on the phenomenal, because like we can describe a hell of a lot about a thing when we're only using the phenomenological language of the thing, like its weight, its color, its speed, its dimensions, all of these things. And so it kind of like raises a question: what's the even purpose of trying to describe the thing in itself when we can already just describe the thing phenomenologically speaking and get all of everything else that you would get even without the thing in itself description.
Right. That even if it's not perfect, it still gives us a lot. And that the fact that we can weigh the same thing over and over again and get almost the exact same measurement means we've got a pretty close understanding of what weight means, even if we're not completely describing whatever property it is that we're trying to.
Sure. Okay. So we can use our phenomenological experience of pressure and attribution of a weight to an object, and we're not referring to the bundle of perceptions or experiences associated with that object, but we're actually referring to some sort of property to the object itself, if we wanted to. But the thing is, by attributing it to this noumenal thing, the thing in itself, then we're just sort of like postulating something that's kind of like unnecessary. it's useful as a model to like, okay, all of these things are located within this area of space and time, and color and size and dimension and speed. These are all part of the same bundle of, or no, this is all part of the same. The reasons that there is kind of this continuity is due to the fact that the properties of color, size, dimensions, weight are properties of a thing rather than a collection of properties without a thing undergirding
them. Like to get weight at all, we probably need a thing, right? We need something that is being weighed, that there's probably something real out there that is being weighed like that. So therefore we should not, while it's possible, it's purely a mental abstraction, most likely because of the consistency and all that. Again, I think everybody who talks about idealism forgets that the one thing we know about mind pretty well is how uncertain it is, that it changes all the time, that it's not very reliable in the sense of it doesn't produce the same result over and over again in the same
that's
way.
Kind of part of Hegel's philosophy is the fact that the world is changing. Like what was held to be as absolute truth within a certain context and frame had to face some sort of antithesis, and then
but wait, you just said the world is changing, but you have to say our understanding of the world is changing.
Our experience of the world is changing, sure.
But not even our experience, our understanding of our experience.
Well,
because our experience of the world going around the sun is the same, whether we think it's a geocentric or heliocentric. But our understanding of what's going on.
Not necessarily, because like our experience itself, it is based within the models that we have. So like what I brought up earlier, I had the phenomenological experience of you having some sort of ill will towards me when you yourself had no such ill will. And it was only through like, hey, what was that thing that you said about my intelligence there? And like, I didn't mean anything by it. That's the antithesis that through this synthesis, antithesis interaction, can a new experience, or maybe even the delegation of my previous experiences, come to a new light.
But isn't it a new understanding of our previous experience?
Let's try this.
Oh, hey, Tyler. Are you gone again?
No.
Oh.
I'm so excited that it's working. I'm letting it sink in. Okay.
Hey, go ahead. We've talked quite a bit.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. What nobody's saying that
unspool.
My intentions at that time were what they were.
Mm-hmm.
Your understanding of my intentions changed based on new information.
Right.
But it doesn't change what my intentions were.
Those at the time, nor my reality. Apprehension of what the subjectively experienced feeling of being slighted there. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So yeah, that is a good point. It's not like the world didn't change. It was our interpretation of the world changed.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And so we have to separate our model, our understanding of the world and of reality and reality. It just seems that what he's saying is that he's just giving the mind too much power. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
From a purely physicalist perspective, though, if understanding represents some particular configuration of neurons and neural network and all that, then when you gain understanding or a particular understanding of the world, it's just another reconfiguration of the world itself. It's always just
sure, but it's a difference between like what we're referring to that's being reconfigured.
Yeah.
It's like if it was the case that every time I had a new interpretation for a thing, the entire world itself, like the atoms and the molecules and everything's cohered to fit that interpretation I had, that would be a much more extravagant claim than the saying the world changed in the sense that my brain or my mind and neurons changed.
I think what you're saying is like thoughts are real. There are real things happening when we have thoughts, but we're talking what is the object of what is the subject of the thoughts.
I'm pointing out that from one perspective, it's quite moot to discuss whether or not an element of the world is changing with regards to the self.
No, but I think what Hegel is saying is that my mind, or at least as Vervaeke described, that our collective minds, our collective understanding is imposing structure on the world rather than we recognize patterns, and our understanding of the world is based on how we perceive those patterns. I think those are two different things. We're not imposing something. We're not impressing something out. We are interpreting what is without.
Yeah, but I mean, in order to recognize a pattern, there has to be some sort of intentionality of the being. So like,
Wait,
I don't know if you
of the pattern recognizing person, or of
yes,
the
the pattern recognizing person. So like, I don't know if you've seen some of Jordan Peterson's lectures, but he has this one of like, okay, I'm going to show you this footage of these basketball players passing a basketball back and forth, and then you have to count how many times they pass the basketball.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they go through and count like it's
through.
like 15 or something like that. And then did you see the gorilla? And then
right.
So yeah, in order to even perceive certain patterns in the world, there has to be some sort of like active participation or of will.
I don't know about that. I think we unconsciously perceive all sorts of patterns. What you're talking about there is, what we're talking about there is when you consciously focus on one thing, you may miss other things. So, but we unconsciously recognize patterns all the time, right? So we don't have to intend to recognize patterns. In fact, I think
Vervaeke actually brings that up with like how far you are from somebody else when you're talking to them. Like there's going to be kind of this instinctive and unconscious change in where you're going to be located with somebody.
Or just like, when you blank out when driving, and to your horror, you realize you have not been paying attention for the last 10 minutes. But and usually when I recognize it, I'm braking. I'm like, how the heck did I brake? When literally I have just blanked out. I was gone for 10 minutes, or at least I have no memory of.
That's pretty wild when that happens. Sometimes I wonder like, oh, I wonder if I could just blank out for this whole trip and then come back. Like, especially for long car rides or something like that you've done multiple times before. But maybe I could
just think of catching a ball. Like, we're not consciously assessing the patterns when we catch a ball. It is purely unconscious. It's just stuff going on, and somehow our hand goes to the right place to catch the ball. Or we run to the right place. We're not.
Yeah, if I wanted to argue my point further, I could say that in order to build up the patterns of being able to catch a ball, that had to include active participation and kind of like an ingraining of this responses into yourself through active focus. But I do think I agree with you that there is quite a good deal of patterns that are being unconsciously or subconsciously aggregated and then presented to us into our conscious without any sort of direct focus or will for ourselves.
I guess the thing I just have problems with is, why are we jumping from this understanding of the patterns to therefore nothing exists other than our understanding of these patterns? There seems to be a hard gap.
Okay, so
like a non sequitur. Where do we get from A?
That you might be attributing too much to Hegel there, because like, okay, similar to like how science is exclusively the understanding of like what can be observed. This isn't saying that the only things that exist are things that can be observed. Like there might be things like consciousness is something that cannot be observed through science, but I mean, we can create models of science, models of consciousness, but it's not something that we have any direct apprehension of through these scientific method. It might be that Hegel is making a similar sort of model of like a science of philosophy or philosophical history or phenomenology of spirit, is his classical work is titled, that is not focusing on like describing an ontology of absolute idealism. Although, well, I mean, describing an ontology in the sense that within the phenomenological world, there is this spirit to history. That's it seems like his argument is that there is almost this animistic component, like the people that we exist as in this present time are smaller subcomponents to the historical narrative of history, which is moving and reacting to things in an almost organism-like fashion. And this entity you could sort of classify as God. Now, of course, this isn't God in the classical theistic sense, because this is purely a God in almost maybe a Jungian sense, that is restricted by the material conditions of reality, and it is not capable of knowing the future, but it is capable of acting insofar as humans are capable of acting, and humans are the subcomponents to the absolute ideal. Yeah.
So do you think Vervaeke is overstating it when he's talking about this divorce between the mind and reality? That they're not quite saying that? That seems to be what you're saying. That they're not quite saying the external world doesn't exist in that same way, or there's a hard.
Okay, so I know, like, Kantianism, the philosophical position of Kant is usually referred to as transcendental idealism, and I don't think that Kant is the same sort of idealist as, say, like George Berkeley, or who was the guy that you were referring to?
Bernardo Castro.
Yeah. Because it seems like Kant recognizes that there are limits to our phenomenology, and there is some sort of thing in itself, but we just have no methods of ascertaining properties to the thing in itself. Now, I'm not as familiar with Hegel. I know Heidegger is a similar sort of phenomenologist. I don't know how to refer to. I mean, it's sort of like idealism, but it's just saying that the only thing worth philosophizing about are the things that are within our experience, which could be like a normative position, without really being an ontological position of the only things that exist are the things within our experience. I don't know. Tyler, you might be more familiar with Hegel to really say what his description of ontology is. Oh no, we've lost the phenomenon of Tyler once
no
more.
Longer exists again. He's popping in and out of existence. Well, you know,
he's flashing the microphone in some sort of SOS message. Let me see. It's like two dots.
Shall we do this by Morse code?
All right. That's okay, Tyler. You don't need it. All right. Is there anything else you want to bring up? Because we've already been talking for 2.5 hours now, I think.
Well, just I think it's interesting. Again, we touch on it briefly. Just, you know, he ends the lecture talking about Marx and hinting at people like Hitler, that it's this attempt to find the promised land that leads to these terrors, to these totalitarian regimes that impose their will on others, and that seems to be the danger of this type of ideology, where you're saying we've just found the answer. Mm-hmm. And but then again, you have to ask, okay, well, should we just assume we don't have the answer? I mean, that doesn't seem satisfying either. You know, it doesn't. I mean, I agree. We should always be open to there being different mm-hmm. answers, that new. And I mean, maybe that's the solution. I think the solution is we should be confident in what we have good reason to be confident in, but we should always be open to the fact that we may be wrong. And that may be where you could not have the hold of dogmatism that leads to these abuses.
There is, I don't know, at least from my biased perspective, a shared commonality with the atrocities committed by, say, the Nazis and the Marxists of the 21st century. No, 20th century, in that they had no real basis of, I guess, synthesizing the antithesis into themselves. So there were certain immutable characteristics of the Jews that made it so that they were not going to be a viable inclusion to the German Reich, Third Reich. There's no sort of within their eschatology of like how the world should be. There was no system in which the people that were of a very of a genetic heritage of Jews would be able to fit within that. And same for Marx's dialectic materialism, where there are certain immutable components to a person. Like for the property owner, it is fully within their worldview in which they cannot conceive of the world otherwise as being a property owner. It's kind of like, and so because they will not, like, they've been brought up into a world in which is not going to be able to fit them within it, they can be killed, like with some sort of justification. And like within dialectic materialism, that is the basis by which things happen, is through the killing off of those things that didn't fit within the system. Now, I say that as like a negative, but I recognize that there is a truth to that. Like, in fact, like Andrew Yang's kind of argument for UBI is the fact that there are certain constraints to what types of jobs people are going to be able to be trained within. So right now, there are a lot of men in the United States that are working as truck drivers. And that's not necessarily that doesn't require a high education or anything like that. And so these are a lot of people that are making a living off of something that is going very closely going to be a non-viable career path for them. And so we have to sort of we have to figure out a way in which they can make it in the world. And it's not just a fact, it's not like we can #learn to code, teach them how to code, because these are people that they, I mean, for one,
they have no aptitude for that.
Yeah, they're not able to learn to code, or maybe they're not even interested in that. Like, so, yeah, it's funny. I was just about to make a point for like why Christianity, with its universalistic forgiveness for even the greatest of enemies, was going to be at least something that distinguishes it from other ideologies in which there is sort of that necessary limitations to, like, either our ideology is genetically based within blood, and so it's not like somebody that's of a different blood can be included into it, or our ideology is ideologically based within our certain understanding of the world, and those that stand to gain through the use of property ownership will be unable to kind of understand it. Except, well, I have heard some modern communists make the arguments that property owners could go through some sort of indoctrination camp in order to finally learn the errors to their ways and be able to accept the communist utopia. But yeah, I mean,
but isn't the problem that in these regimes they thought they found the final synthesis? Because it would seem to me that if we take a probability approach, there are so many ideas that have come and gone over the ages, that the odds that there won't be a new antithesis have got to be pretty darn small for any given idea. So that we should always assume that whatever we think today is the answer, something is going to come to change to maybe give us a different perspective. Even if we have got it 100% right by some chance, we can't know that with any kind of certainty. So we should always be open to the fact that we get it wrong. And you take that to the Jews, whatever they think about the Jews, we can be open to the fact that our understanding is not correct on this, and therefore, hey, maybe we shouldn't exterminate them all. And and for Marx, yes, we could say this class system and these class ideas are important, but maybe they're not the be all and end all. Maybe they're not the only things that are important, and therefore we must destroy everything that came before it, or that the revolution is the way to go. What do you do once the revolution's over? Is there no more participatory meeting? I mean, that revolution can only take you so far, unless you're going to always be in a state of revolution. So that, again, the way to avoid dogmatism is to just be open to the fact that you're wrong. And Hegel, the natural result of Hegel should not be we're all going to this one inevitable point, but that we can't know when we get to that point. So we can't know the difference between, we can't tell to any degree of certainty when we've reached that point of final synthesis. Therefore, we should be open to the fact that we haven't reached it.
Yeah, and maybe that's a clear distinguishment between Hegel and Marx. Is Hegel's reading of history is a dialectic between ideas, and like how ideas are able to interact with each other and correspond with each other in such a way. Whereas Marx's reading of history is a dialectic of material conditions, and
why can't they both be right? Like why do we have to say, because like Marx can have gotten some things right? Yes, these battles over material conditions have happened and they're important, but why are they the only thing? Why is class the only thing a socialist should think is important? Maybe it's not. Maybe there are other things in addition to class. Why is ideas are important, but they maybe should not be the only thing we think about. It's this desire to just say, this is good, therefore it's the only thing that's good and everything else is bad. That seems to lead to atrocity.
Right. I mean, I do like between those two readings of history, I do think that there is a benefit that Hegel's has on a normative sense, because of course, maybe it's just buying into the sort of blank slate idea of where ideas are able to kind of shape the conditions of the mind so that they'll be more accepting of them. Whereas the materialistic understanding is that the material conditions of the world are what provide the ideas to kind of come forth. I think that by having this abstraction of battle taking place within sort of a spirit form or within an ideological, like a dialectic of actual conversation through logos, it is a more beneficial worldview to have on a psychological or normative sense.
But I guess
due to the
my
fact
problem
that it
is
involved
calling it a worldview. I mean, in a sort of a complete sense, rather than just our interaction with the world, like Vervaeke's talked about before. It seemed like the world's complicated and humans are complicated, and there's lots of patterns going on in humans. These it just seems to me that they're all identifying different patterns that are to some extent real. The patterns that Marx recognized, have some merit. It's just, as long as we don't think they're the only patterns out there, because there are other patterns that are important. This is why, again, like the socialists, who just focus on class, and then conservatives who focus on other stuff. They're just seem to me they're recognizing different patterns and putting the emphasis on different patterns. And whereas maybe we should be saying, hey, let's think about all these patterns together and think of how they can interplay with one another, and not just they all seem to want to focus on this is the thing to focus on and forget about everything else, rather than saying, okay, these are the things these are the dynamics that are causing big impacts in our world. And we can't address all of them because that's not practical. Let's identify a few of these dynamics and focus on them. That seems to me to be a more way to it's less dogmatic, and it's more working together to say that there's different ways of looking at these patterns, and we're trying to figure out how they interplay together. I guess that's intersectionality, right? Which has been demonized quite a lot. I think probably unfairly, but I've just started looking into that.
Well, so like intersectionality in that, like, it's creating a system of where we can like compare the, like, even having there's differing positions that people hold, we can make sort of like some sort of judgments between, okay, I guess I'm not seeing how the intersectionality is connected to it.
Well, no, it's just that it seems to be demonized.
Oh,
there's just all these intersecting.
I see. Recognizing patterns, that there are these differing intersections for like
right, and that it's not just identity politics. It's saying we can recognize there are these intersection vectors that cross each other in all sorts of different ways, and that we shouldn't just focus on one or another, but we should. Sometimes we've got to zero in on the individual, and other times we need to span back out to see these patterns. Because the fact is, we as irregular as humans are, we have a lot of regularity to us, and we can recognize patterns on a large scale that don't necessarily apply to every individual. But for public policy, we can't make public policy based solely on the individual. It's just not a practical way to do it. We can't just say, I'm going to make public policy for that guy. We have to recognize trends. And it seems to me that these different thinkers are recognizing different trends and then putting all their eggs in that basket. Marx especially. I mean, social that's where you get to. It's putting your eggs in that basket and assuming this is the answer. This is the pattern that we need to fix.
I don't know. There's a way in which, like, your description of it just seems like it fails to actually like point out the reasons why people hold to these great positions. Like, the reason that Marx held to the position that he had was due to the fact that it seemed most accurate, and because it was most accurate, it entailed like certain actions to associate to go along with it. And if he like instead had a certain degree of like I don't know, standing off from almost a third person perspective, or maybe like holding a bit of doubt towards that position, then it would have only just made it so that he wouldn't be able to act upon this belief.
Oh, okay, no, but that's different. I think I'm not saying don't act. I'm saying act on the best information you have, but be open to the fact that you could be wrong, and maybe therefore you don't kill each other.
Right.
It's like Marx. Okay, I think there's a lot of problems with religion, but if one thing this Vervaeke course has taught us is there are some really good things about religion that have been very positive. Now, Marx focused on certain negative aspects of religion, and I think probably with a lot of that he was personally, I think he's probably right with some of that, but he ignored a lot of the other stuff. And just like all these guys, that Vervaeke's big point is all these guys are ignoring the participatory gnosis benefits that the various religions have helped us with, and that just focusing on the ideological sort of propositional aspects of religion. So in doing so, in identifying the negatives of, we see this in the anti-theists today, where it's just focusing on the Crusades and even today, the radical right and the religious right, and they focus on all the bad stuff with very little focus on the good stuff. And it's once you identify certain patterns are a problem, like I can agree those patterns are a problem without saying all the patterns surrounding that are problems. That there are some good patterns in there too. So Marx zeroed in on certain patterns to the exclusion, and he wasn't open to the fact that he could be wrong about what is, and whether Marx did or not, the people who then killed in his name, certainly weren't open to the fact they were wrong. Because when you're more open to the fact that you're wrong, I think you're more moderate in how you go about it, and you don't go and slaughter everybody who has who has a different view.
Let's hope so. That'd be quite interesting. Somebody that was like an uncertain dictator, like, well, I'm not sure, but let's do it anyway. But
yeah, how long we've been going about 2 hours, and
Yeah.
and
oh yeah, go ahead, Smith.
Yes, I have had these kind of conversations with my colleagues, especially one of them. So what happens is I tell him, how bad the situation is in the country and everything, and we would be better off if we were to just, take out 80% of the population, and then 20%
to
can live
Thanos,
in peace.
to Thanos, everybody, 80% of the. So
Yeah.
you're
even more than Thanos.
Even more than Thanos. You added 30% to Thanos. That's an Avengers. That's an Avengers reference. If
I know. I've seen that movie. So yeah.
Okay.
So and these kind of in that situation, I am that bad, evil, dictator type. Except for that, I'm not. But just pretend that I am. And
right.
Then they tell me, so who are you going to decide to kill? Who is worth living? Who is not worth living? And all that complications. And after they point out all the antithesis, as you folks call it, then I'm exactly like, you know what, I'm not too sure if I want to do it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, but I mean, it still like raises, at least for I know that you've talked about this a couple times before, like for yourself in your own position, you're living in a situation where there's too many people to, like, given the circumstances of the place, like there's way too much kind of going on there. Yeah, there's need to be. I don't want to like. I should probably just shut up right now. Actually, but yeah, I mean, ideally we could come up with somebody could be able to come up with other solutions that don't require mass genocide.
Well, once you identify somebody as the problem, and especially if you frame it in terms of evil, then. I mean, I studied a lot of Hitler back in university. I wrote a number of papers on him, and he truly believed certain groups were vermin. And what do you do with vermin? We exterminate vermin, right? So if you get to the point where you truly believe these people are evil, it makes it a lot easier to recommend, genociding them, because you no longer see them as human. You see them as evil. Like as vampires, as monsters, right? But if you say, well, that's just a story we tell, and that's one perspective. Maybe there are different perspectives. Suddenly you're like, okay, well, maybe they're not inhuman. Maybe there's something more. Hey, I'm starting to get tired too.
Yeah. We better wrap it up. All right. Yeah.
That's true.
Go ahead, Smith.
Because that's true. Because when you have too many people, you are working on it's people.
Sorry, you're cutting out. Can you repeat?
Hello.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, there are these small things like.
Oh no.
I'm sorry, Samit. We're getting every other word, dude.
All right. Sorry, Samit. Anyway, it's late. We'll stay on Tyler and Samit, and I don't know. Maybe we'll switch over to Discord since Tyler seems to be having still issues going on. But yeah, thanks everybody for watching. If we'll be discussing lecture 25 and maybe 26. I don't know. It depends. It seems like we're into that transition between away from the history of philosophy and more into like Vervaeke's kind of understanding of cognitive science and things like that. So that'll be interesting to get into that. And maybe we'll even include more episodes, like if they're not as dense as some of these have been. We'll go over 3 because I want to catch up because he's like 5 episodes away from the conclusion. I want to kind of.
Oh, is that what he said?
Yeah, there's going to be 50. So right now he's on 45, I think.
Oh, So there's no way we can catch up in real time. Anyway.
No. But I at least for myself, I think I'll want to catch up, or at least as quick as I can. Yeah.
Is he going to stop making videos, or is he just going to move on to other?
He's still doing like Q&As, but this is like his main project that he's been working on. So that'll at least be finished and maybe kind of put it up for, I guess, peer review for his audience to kind of like figure out.
Well, I'm really curious to see what sort of boots on the ground stuff he has thinking, whether this is just an intellectual exercise or if he really is trying to develop something. I mean, I live right near him, so that would actually be something I could.
Yeah, that'd be cool if you could, like, if he does any like public lectures or something like that, to be able to see that. All right, cool. We've got our links down below. Join us on Discord for stimulating conversation that happens every now and then, either in text or in voice chat. And yeah, be well.
Great. Thanks, everyone.